What would you do if, just when you lost everything, someone even more broken appeared at your door, hunted and running out of time? After burying his father, a young rancher believed the silence of the land would be the hardest thing he'd ever face, until he followed a trail of blood into the woods and found a wounded native woman carrying a secret powerful enough to change the entire valley. Helping her meant risking his life and uncovering a truth about his own past he was never meant to know. So how did one desperate choice turn into a fight for survival, redemption, and something neither of them expected? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. Let's step into the story. The wind moved quietly across the Red Hollow Valley, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and old grass. Ethan Cole stood alone in front of the fresh mound of earth that marked his father's grave. The soil was still dark and damp, uneven, where it had been turned just hours earlier. A simple wooden cross stood at the head, his father's name carved into it, with rough, uneven lines. Lines Ethan himself had cut hand steady, only because he refused to let them shake. There hadn't been many people at the burial. A few neighbors had come standing at a distance, hats in their hands, murmuring to one another in low voices that carried just enough for Ethan to hear without truly listening. He knew what they were saying. They had been saying it for days now. Shame about his father. Boy won't last long out here alone. He'll sell. They always do. One of them had stepped a little closer before leaving, clearing his throat awkwardly. If you ever decide the land's too much, Ethan, I'd be willing to make a fair offer. Ethan hadn't answered. He hadn't even looked up. His eyes stayed fixed on the ground, on the place where his father had been lowered into the earth. His fingers tightened around the old pocket watch resting in his palm, the one his father had carried for years. It still ticked faint and steady, as if time itself hadn't noticed anything had changed. When the last of the neighbors rode away, the valley fell silent again. Ethan didn't move. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The wind brushed against his coat, but he barely felt it. There was no sharp pain, no tears threatening to fall, just a heavy emptiness that pressed against his chest, dull and constant, like something that would never quite go away. Eventually, he turned and walked back toward the ranch. From a distance, it looked like a place that had already been abandoned. The fences leaned at odd angles, broken in places where time and neglect had finally won. The grass was patchy and dry, more brown than green. The barn stood with its doors half-hanging, one hinge completely rusted through. Ethan passed by the corral where the ground was worn from years of use. He could almost hear the echo of his father's voice, calling out instructions, laughing when Ethan made mistakes, correcting him with patience. But the sound wasn't real. It faded as quickly as it came, leaving behind nothing but the creak of old wood and the low whistle of the wind. Inside the barn, a few tools lay scattered, forgotten where they had last been used. A shovel leaned against the wall, its handle worn smooth. A rope hung from a nail frayed at the ends. Everything felt like it had been left mid-motion, as if the world had stopped the moment his father had. Later that afternoon, a couple of neighbors stopped by. They didn't stay long. They asked how he was holding up, offered a few words that sounded practiced rather than sincere. Then carefully, almost politely, they circled back to the same subject. You know, it's a lot of land for one man. No shame in letting it go. Ethan gave short answers, nods, one-word replies, enough to end the conversation without inviting more. He didn't argue. He didn't agree. He simply refused to engage. When they left, he picked up a hammer and a bundle of wire and walked toward the nearest broken section of fence. He worked until the sun dipped low, fixing boards, tightening posts. Not because he believed it would change anything, but because his hands remembered what to do. Because standing still felt worse. The days that followed blurred together. Ethan woke before sunrise, just as he always had. He worked until his body ached, ate whatever was easiest to prepare, and fell into bed without thinking. He spoke to no one. Sometimes he didn't speak at all. The routine remained, but the purpose behind it had vanished. He wasn't sure what he was trying to hold on to anymore. The ranch didn't improve. It didn't get worse either. It simply existed just like him. One afternoon, while repairing a fence near the far edge of the property, Ethan noticed something unusual. A dark stain on the dry grass caught his eye. He crouched down, brushing his fingers lightly over it. Blood. It wasn't old. The color was still deep, not yet faded by the sun. He stood slowly, scanning the ground around him. There were more spots spaced unevenly, trailing toward the line of trees that marked the beginning of the forest. Ethan's jaw tightened. This wasn't from a clean kill. There were drag marks, subtle but there. Something or someone had been moving while injured. He remained still for a moment, listening. The wind shifted through the trees, but nothing else moved. Then, without fully deciding, he began to follow the trail. The forest swallowed sound differently than the open land. The air felt heavier, cooler. Light filtered through the branches in broken patches. Each step Ethan took was careful, deliberate, guided by instinct more than thought. The blood trail grew more scattered, but it didn't disappear. He found her near a fallen tree. Ayanna Redbird lay slumped against the trunk, her body half curled, as if she had tried to keep moving, until she couldn't anymore. Her shoulder was soaked in blood, the fabric torn open where the wound cut deep. Her breathing was shallow, uneven. One hand was clenched tightly around a small leather pouch. Ethan dropped to one knee beside her, checking for signs of life. Her skin was warm, her pulse weak but there. If he left her, she wouldn't last long. Then he heard it. Faint at first, but unmistakable, the distant rhythm of horses. Ethan's head snapped up. He listened again. More than one rider, moving fast. This wasn't random. His eyes moved back to the woman, then to the direction of the sound, then back again. He could walk away, pretend he hadn't seen anything, stay out of whatever trouble this was. Or he could help her and invite that trouble straight to his door. For a brief moment he hesitated. Then, without warning, a memory surfaced. His father's voice, calm, certain. A man's worth shows in who he protects. Ethan exhaled slowly. Damn it. He slid his arms under Ayanna's body and lifted her carefully. She was lighter than he expected. He carried her back toward his horse, working quickly now, aware that time was slipping. He mounted, pulling her in front of him, and turned away from the obvious path. Instead of heading straight back, he took a wider route, weaving through less traveled ground, doing his best to avoid leaving a clear trail. When he reached the ranch, he didn't go to the house. He took her to the old back stable, half-hidden, rarely used anymore. Inside it was dim and quiet. Dust hung in the air. He laid her gently onto a bed of old hay, then moved quickly, grabbing watercloth, anything he could use to treat the wound. By the time he returned, she was beginning to stir. Her eyes snapped open. For a split second, confusion flickered across her face. Then instinct took over. She moved fast, pulling a knife from somewhere within reach and pointing it directly at him. "Don't come closer." Her voice was weak but steady enough to carry the threat. Ethan froze, raising his hand slightly. "Easy. I'm not here to hurt you. Stay back." He took a step backward, giving her space. "All right." They stared at each other, tension thick between them. Her breathing quickened, but the knife remained steady. After a moment, Ethan slowly crouched and placed a canteen and a small bundle of food on the ground between them. Then he stood again and stepped farther away. "I'll leave it there," he said. "You can take it when you want." He turned and walked out of the stable. Time passed. When he came back, the water was gone, the food partially eaten. He didn't comment. Instead, he approached slowly, watching her reaction. The knife was still in her hand, but her grip had weakened. "I need to look at that wound," he said quietly. She didn't respond. He waited. Eventually, exhaustion won where trust had not. Her arm lowered slightly. Ethan moved in, careful, deliberate. He cleaned the wound as best he could, ignoring the way she tensed at every touch. He worked slowly, minimizing the pain, speaking only when necessary. "It's deep, but not fatal. You're lucky." She said nothing. When he finished, he secured the bandage and leaned back. That was when he noticed the pouch again. Her hand tightened around it instinctively, even in her weakened state. He caught a brief glimpse of what was inside a folded piece of paper. Markings, lines, symbols he didn't recognize. He didn't reach for it. But something about it stayed with him. She wasn't just running. She was carrying something important. Later, her voice broke the silence. "They'll kill you." Ethan looked at her. "Anyone who helps me. They won't leave alive." Her eyes met his steady despite the exhaustion. Ethan didn't answer, but something in his expression shifted. Before either of them could say more, the sound came again. Closer this time. Hooves. Multiple. They stopped just outside the ranch. Ethan stood immediately. "Stay here," he said. He stepped out into the fading light. Victor Hayes dismounted first. Tall, clean, controlled. The kind of man who carried authority like it belonged to him. Two others followed behind him. Hayes glanced around the property, taking in every detail before his eyes settled on Ethan. "Afternoon." Ethan nodded once. "What can I do for you?" Hayes stepped closer. "We're looking for someone." Ethan said nothing. "A native woman," Hayes continued. "Injured. Came through this area not long ago." Ethan's expression didn't change. "Haven't seen anyone." Hayes studied him. Silence stretched. One of the riders shifted, glancing toward the back of the property, toward the stable. Ethan moved slightly, just enough to block the line of sight. "Place looks quiet," Hayes said slowly. "It is." Another pause. Then Hayes stepped in closer, his voice dropping just enough to feel personal. "If you're lying, I'll know." Ethan didn't move, didn't blink. Like I said, he replied evenly, "Haven't seen anyone." For a long moment, Hayes simply stared at him. Then finally, he stepped back. "All right." He mounted his horse again. "But if she comes through here," he added, his tone colder, "now you might want to think real carefully about what you do next." With that, he turned. The others followed. The sound of hooves faded into the distance. Ethan stood where he was watching until they were gone. Only then did he allow himself to breathe. When he returned to the stable, Ayanna was exactly where he had left her. But everything felt different. He looked at her, really looked this time, and in that moment, he understood something he hadn't fully realized before. Nothing about his life was the same anymore. And whatever came next, he was already part of it. If you were Ethan, would you risk everything to save her? And what do you think Ayanna is hiding that makes so many men hunt her down? Let us know your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe before we dive into the most intense part of the story. The days after Hayes rode away did not return the ranch to silence. They changed the kind of silence that lived there. Ayanna did not die. That in itself felt like something that shouldn't have been possible. By the third day, she was awake more often than not. She could sit up without collapsing, though it clearly cost her. Her movements were controlled careful, like every inch of motion had to be measured before she allowed it. The knife never left her reach. Even when she slept, it rested close enough that her fingers could find it without looking. Ethan didn't try to take it from her. He didn't try to get close either. Instead, he worked around her. He left food where she could reach it without crossing the space between them. He set down water, clean cloth, medicine, always the same distance away, always within sight. Then he stepped back. Sometimes he stayed. Sometimes he left. But he never pushed. The air between them was still tense, but it had changed. It was no longer the sharp, immediate edge of danger. It was something quieter now. Suspicion, yes, but layered with something else. Something that hadn't been there before. Time. Ethan returned each morning to change the bandages on her shoulder. The wound was still angry, still deep, but it was healing. Slowly. He spoke only when he had to. This might sting. Hold still. Almost done. She didn't answer. Not with words. But she didn't stop him anymore. When she pulled away, he didn't follow. When she refused something, he set it down and gave her space. He never asked questions he didn't need answers to. It wasn't kindness that changed things. It was consistency. One morning, when he returned with water, he placed it a little closer than usual. Not within reach, but closer. Ayanna looked at it for a long moment. Then slowly she leaned forward and took it. She didn't push it away. That was the first shift. Another came when he stepped back after cleaning her wound, and instead of collapsing into stillness, she reached for the cloth herself. Her movements were rough, unpracticed, but deliberate. She rewrapped part of the bandage, adjusting it in a way that made more sense to her. Ethan didn't interrupt. He simply watched. From that point on, their silence began to carry meaning. It was no longer empty. He started bringing her outside during the day. At first, only for a few minutes. Just enough to sit in the open air, away from the stale quiet of the stable. She kept her distance, always aware of where he stood, always tracking him with her eyes. Ethan didn't approach. Instead, he worked. He checked the soil, crumbling it between his fingers, studying its dryness. He showed her how to tell when land could still be saved and when it couldn't. He repaired sections of fence, explaining nothing, simply doing the work as he always had. Ayanna watched. Carefully. She didn't ask questions. But she didn't miss anything. A few days later, she stood without assistance. The first time she nearly fell. Ethan moved instinctively, catching her before she hit the ground. For a second, everything froze. She was close enough that he could feel the tension in her body, the instinct to react, to pull away, to fight. But she didn't. She didn't reach for the knife. She didn't step back. They stayed there, caught in a moment neither of them had planned. Then she slowly pulled herself upright. "Don't," she said quietly. "I won't," Ethan replied, stepping back. But something had changed. That moment didn't disappear. It stayed with them, settling into the space between them like something new, something unspoken, but understood. Not long after, she led him to the edge of the forest. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a suggestion. She simply walked, and for the first time, he followed. She stopped at a patch of soft ground and pointed. Ethan looked down. At first, he saw nothing. Then she crouched, brushing the dirt lightly with her fingers. The marks became clearer. Tracks. Deer, he guessed. She shook her head. "Too narrow," she said. "And see here. The pressure is wrong." She shifted slightly, showing him the difference. Then she pointed to another set. "Human," she said. "Older. 2 days." Ethan frowned. "How can you tell?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she moved again, tracing patterns, showing him how the ground spoke if you knew how to listen. She showed him how to find water without seeing it, how to read the plants, the way they leaned, the subtle changes in color. She showed him how to move without leaving a trail, how to step where the ground would hide his weight. Ethan had spent his entire life on that land, but he realized then how little he truly understood it. "You learned all this?" Where, he asked. She didn't answer, but her silence carried something heavier this time. That night she finally spoke. "Hayes took it," she said. Ethan looked up from the fire. "My people's land. He came with men, with guns. Said it belonged to him now." Her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something tightly controlled. "What happened to the others?" Ethan asked. She stared into the fire. "They stayed," she said. "Some fought." A pause. "They're gone now." Ethan didn't press further. He didn't need to. The next morning she opened the pouch. Carefully, for the first time, she let him see it clearly. A map, hand-drawn but precise. Markings that followed patterns he didn't fully understand, but some of them looked familiar. "This," she said, pointing to a specific location, "is water." Ethan frowned. "There's no water out there." "There is," she replied. "Deep." He studied the map again. "If this is real?" "It is. If someone controlled it." "They control everything around it," she finished. The realization settled slowly. This wasn't just about land. It was about power. And somehow, his ranch sat right in the middle of it. That same afternoon, a neighbor rode past. He didn't stop, didn't call out, but his eyes lingered. Too long, Ethan noticed. Ayanna did too. Neither of them said anything. But something in the air shifted again. That night the ranch felt wrong. Too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ethan stood outside longer than usual, scanning the dark horizon. Ayanna remained near the stable, her posture tense, her eyes constantly moving. "They'll come," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "I know. It happened after midnight. At first, it was only a flicker, a faint glow at the edge of the barn. Then the smell. Smoke." Ethan turned just as the first flames broke through the dry wood, climbing fast, hungry. "Fire," he ran. Ayanna was already moving. The fire spread quickly, feeding on everything the dry season had left behind. Wood cracked and splintered as the heat intensified. Shadows moved in the dark, figures circling, closing in. Not an accident. Never an accident. "Go," Ethan shouted, grabbing her arm. She didn't resist. They moved fast, cutting away from the flames, heading for the horses. Behind them, voices rose, men shouting, boots hitting dirt. "They're here." Ethan didn't look back. He cut the reins loose, swung into the saddle, and pulled Ayanna up behind him. The horse surged forward, hooves pounding against the ground as they broke away from the ranch. The fire lit the sky behind them. For a brief moment, Ethan turned. The barn was already collapsing. The place he had grown up in, what little remained of it, was disappearing into flame. Then he faced forward again. There was nothing left to save. They rode until the fire was no longer visible, until the only sound left was the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them, and the distant echo of something burning far behind. When they finally stopped, it was deep in the forest. The world was dark again. Still. Too still. Ethan slid off the horse, his legs unsteady from the ride. He didn't speak, didn't move much at all. Ayanna watched him. "You lost everything," she said. He didn't answer, because there was nothing to say. After a moment, she stepped back. "I have to go," she said. Ethan looked up. "If I stay, they'll keep coming. For you, I know. I can handle it." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You can't. Not this." Silence stretched between them. "I won't let you die because of me," she added. Ethan took a slow breath. Then another. "You think this is about you," he said quietly. She frowned. "It stopped being about that the moment I picked you up," he continued. "They burned my home. They'll come for me whether you're here or not." Ayanna didn't respond. "I'm already in this," he said. "There's no going back." She studied him, searching for hesitation. There wasn't any. "I can't do this alone," she said. "You're not alone," Ethan replied. Another silence. But this one was different. Not distance, not doubt. Something else, something stronger. And this time, neither of them stepped away. They stayed in the forest until the first gray light of morning crept through the trees. Neither of them slept much. Ethan sat with his back against a fallen trunk, the folded map in his hands, turning it over again and again, as if the paper itself might offer answers if he stared at it long enough. Ayanna rested not far away, though rest was not the right word for the way she sat half awake, alert, even in silence. When the sun rose higher, Ethan finally opened the map again and studied it with more care than before. In the pale morning light, he noticed something he had missed. A small, carved symbol repeated itself at several points along the edges, simple, almost meaningless at first glance. But the longer he looked, the more it unsettled him. He had seen that mark before, not on paper, on wood, on the old fence posts at the far end of the ranch, on the underside of one beam in the barn, on a survey stake his father had once driven into the ground and later yanked back out when Ethan was still too young to understand what it meant. A cold feeling moved through him. He traced the symbol with his thumb. Then once more, slower. It was the same shape. Not close, not similar. The same. Ayanna noticed the change in his face. "What is it?" Ethan did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed on the map, but his mind had already slipped backward years into the past, pulling loose fragments of memory with it. He remembered men arriving at the ranch after dark. Not often, but enough times that it had made an impression on him as a boy. Strangers speaking quietly with his father near the corral. Lantern light moving across the yard. Conversations cut short whenever Ethan came too close. His father telling him to get back inside. His father riding out before dawn and returning with mud on his boots and an expression Ethan had never known how to read. He remembered wooden stakes marked with symbols, boundaries drawn and redrawn. His father walking the land with a measuring rope, stopping to hammer signs into the ground. At the time, Ethan had thought it was just ranch work, just part of being a man who knew the land. Now, with the map in his hand, those scattered memories began to lock into place with terrifying clarity. His father had known these markings. Worse than that, his father had helped create them. Ethan's chest tightened. He rose halfway to his feet, then stopped. The world around him seemed to tilt the trees, blurring for a moment, as understanding struck with full force. Hayes had not taken land blindly. He had surveyed it first, marked it, claimed it. And the symbols on the map were the same ones Ethan's father had used. That meant only one thing. His father had worked for Hayes. Not in passing, not by accident. He had helped mark the land that Hayes later stole. The paper slipped from Ethan's fingers and fell into the dirt. For a long moment he could not move. He felt as if something inside him had been split open. The ranch, the fences, the old stories, every hard lesson his father had taught him, suddenly none of it felt solid anymore. The man Ethan had buried only days earlier was no longer just the father who had taught him to ride to mend wood to stand his ground. He was also somehow a man tied to the very violence that had shattered Ayanna's people. Ethan pressed a hand to the back of his neck and turned away, breathing hard. "What is it?" Ayanna asked again, sharper this time. He looked at her then, and there was no way to soften what had to be said. He stooped, picked up the map, and walked toward her slowly. "I know these marks," he said. Ayanna's expression changed at once. How Ethan swallowed. "Because my father used them." She stared at him. He forced himself to keep going. "When I was a boy, there were men who came to the ranch. Men I didn't know. My father would ride with them sometimes. He marked parts of the land. I thought it was work. I thought it was ranch business." His voice grew rougher. "It wasn't. Not all of it." Ayanna rose to her feet. Ethan didn't stop. He knew stopping would only make it worse. "I think he helped Hayes survey the valley," he said. "I think he helped mark the land Hayes wanted to take." Ayanna's face went still in a way that was somehow worse than anger. "These symbols," Ethan continued, holding up the map with a trembling hand. "They're the same. I didn't see it before. But now I know." He drew in a slow breath. "If that's true, then my father was part of what happened to your people." Silence. The kind that does not wait for an answer, because it already contains the wound. Ayanna looked at him as if she no longer recognized the man standing in front of her. The trust that had taken shape over days of silence, pain work, and survival broke apart in her eyes with brutal speed. "You knew?" she asked. "No. But his son lived on the land." "Yes, and you never questioned why Hayes wanted this valley so badly." Ethan had no defense. "No." Her jaw tightened. For several seconds, she said nothing, and that only made the moment heavier. Then she took one step back. "I let you near me," she said quietly. "I trusted you. I know. You brought me food, treated my wound, hid me from the men hunting me." Her voice was steady, but there was fire beneath it now. "And all this time, your family's hands were already on this?" Ethan lowered his eyes. "I didn't know. But that doesn't change what it is." "No," Ayanna said. "It doesn't." She turned away. Ethan did not reach for her. He wanted to, but he didn't. Some instinct told him that trying to stop her now would only turn injury into insult. Ayanna, she faced him once more, and there was no softness left in her expression. "I cannot stay beside the son of a man who helped steal my people's land." The words struck harder because they were deserved. Then she left. No more than that. No final speech, no dramatic exit. She simply took her knife, the map, and what remained of her strength, and walked into the trees until the forest swallowed her. Ethan stood where he was long after she disappeared. The silence that followed was far worse than the silence he had known after his father's funeral. That silence had been emptiness. This was accusation. He remained alone in the woods through the day and into the night. With no horse, no home worth returning to, and no clear path forward, he stayed near the dying remains of their camp and let the truth settle over him piece by piece. His father had taught him honorable things. That was true. But honor had not been the whole of him. And Ethan, whether he liked it or not, had inherited more than land. He had inherited the consequences of whatever his father had done. By morning, the guilt had not lessened, but it had changed shape. At first, it had been crushing a weight so complete that it left no room for thought. Now it became something else, a choice. He could not undo the past. He could not raise the dead or return stolen years to people he had never known. He could not make his father innocent, but he could choose what came next. That realization arrived slowly, almost reluctantly, but once it did, it settled deep. Ethan rose, gathered what little remained, and stared at the valley beyond the trees. "If I walk away now," he muttered to himself, then haze winds twice. He asked himself no further questions after that. He would find the water, even if he had to do it alone, even if no one ever forgave him for why it mattered, even if the land that came alive from it never truly belonged to him. This was no longer about rescuing Ayanna, no longer about protecting a stranger. It was about setting one thing right in a world full of wrongs. He packed the map carefully and prepared to move. That was when he saw her. Ayanna stood between two pines several yards away, half shadowed by the morning light. She had been there long enough to watch him. Ethan could tell by the stillness in her posture. Neither of them moved at first. Then Ethan straightened and let his hands fall to his sides. "I'm not going to stop," he said. Ayanna did not step closer. "I know." He waited. Her gaze drifted to the map, then back to his face. "You could have left. I thought about it. But you didn't." "No." Another long silence. At last she said, "You are not your father." Ethan's expression tightened, but he said nothing. "He made his choices," she continued. "You have made others. I'm still carrying what he did." "Yes," she said. "And you are trying to do something with it." That was as close to forgiveness as he expected, and it was more than he had any right to ask for. Ayanna finally stepped forward, though not all the way to him. "I left because I needed to remember the difference," she said, "between blood and the person standing in front of me." Ethan nodded once. And I know the difference now." Something in him loosened for the first time since finding the symbol on the map. They did not embrace. They did not apologize again. The moment was too raw, too honest for grand gestures. But the understanding between them was deeper now than it had ever been before. It no longer rested on gratitude or debt or even trust in the ordinary sense. It rested on choice. "We do this together?" Ethan asked. Ayanna's eyes sharpened. Not to survive. He understood. To stop him. She gave a single nod. From there, everything became clearer. They crouched over the map on a flat stone and planned in practical terms. Ethan studied the shape of the valley, the slopes, the dry gullies, the places where water would most likely gather or rise. He knew the ground in ways he had never realized were useful before. Ayanna marked the safest routes, the hidden lines of movement that would leave little trace. She knew how Hayes's riders would search broad, obvious, careless in some places, because they believed fear alone would flush prey into the open. "We go here," Ethan said, tracing a narrow route between two ridges. "Less direct but faster if the wash stays clear." "They will check the open trail first," Ayanna said. "Not this way." They split tasks without needing to argue them. Ethan would lead where the land itself mattered most. Ayanna would read signs, keep them hidden, and warn of pursuit before it got close. Their plan was simple: reach the water first, confirm it, and take away Hayes's chance to claim it cleanly. They crossed the dry country in hard silence. The valley opened before them in long stretches of cracked earth and faded grass, the heat rising in pale waves. At each point marked on the map, they compared symbol to stone ridge to line memory to fact. What had once seemed like guesswork began to fit together with unsettling precision. By afternoon, they knew they were close. And then the signs changed. Ayanna crouched beside a patch of disturbed dust and touched it lightly. Fresh. Ethan saw it now, hoof prints sharper than theirs. A heel mark, a boot edge. "They're moving fast," he said. "They know we are near." The pressure of time became immediate. Every step from then on carried the sense that something was closing around them. At last they reached a shallow basin ringed by hard, stony ground. Nothing about it looked important at first. It was just another dead piece of earth in a valley full of them. but Ayanna knelt and pressed her fingers into a seam in the soil where the color changed almost imperceptibly. Ethan followed suit, digging with his hands. The upper crust was dry brittle. Beneath it, the ground was cool, then damp. Ethan stopped and looked at her. "It's here," he said. Ayanna's breathing caught, though her face remained composed. Yes, it was not a spring bursting from rock. Not yet. Just moisture hidden beneath dead land. But it was enough. Enough to prove the map was real. Enough to prove that Hayes' hunger for this valley had never been a guess. Enough to change everything. A voice behind them broke the moment cleanly in two. "I was hoping you'd save me the trouble." Hayes. Ethan turned slowly. Victor Hayes stood on the ridge above them with 3 men spread behind him. Dust clung to their boots and horses, proof that they had ridden hard. Hayes himself looked almost pleased. "I had a feeling you'd understand the map eventually," he said, glancing at Ethan. "Runs in the family." The words hit their mark. Ayanna shifted beside Ethan, knife already in hand. "Give me the map," Hayes said, "and I may decide not to bury you both out here." Ethan rose to his feet. "No." Hayes smiled without warmth. "You inherited your father's stubbornness. I didn't inherit his loyalty to you." Something ugly flashed in Hayes' eyes. "Careful, boy." One of the men dismounted, then another. The basin suddenly felt small. "We can end this quickly," Hayes said. "Or painfully." Ethan stepped slightly in front of Ayanna. "You don't own this land." Hayes laughed once. "Ownership is decided by the man who can hold it." Then he gestured. The men moved in. The first clash was fast and ugly, more struggle than skill. Ethan drove one man back with a hard shoulder and caught another across the jaw, but numbers turned against him immediately. Ayanna vanished to the side, using motion instead of force, cutting through openings before they could close. Still, Hayes' men were bigger, heavier armed, with the certainty of men who believed victory was already theirs. Ethan fought hard, but he was driven backward. A blow struck his ribs, another his shoulder. He staggered, regained his footing, then lost it again when a boot caught him behind the knee. He hit the ground hard. Dust filled his mouth. Before he could rise, one of Hayes' men slammed him down again. Hayes descended into the basin at a measured pace, calm now that the outcome seemed certain. "Your father understood something you never did," he said. "Land belongs to whoever is willing to do what's necessary." Ethan tried to push up, but another strike sent pain through his side so sharply that his arms nearly gave out. Across the basin he saw Ayanna for only a second gone, then gone again, between stone and shadow. Hayes noticed too late. She came from the side like a sudden wind, striking one of the men at the shoulder and sending him crashing into another. The hold on Ethan loosened for the briefest instant. That was enough. Ethan rolled free, dragged himself upright, and grabbed the dropped handle of a broken tool someone had brought to dig. Hayes stepped back, surprised for the first time. Now the fight changed. Ayanna did not attack head-on. She broke rhythm, distracted, redirected, forced Hayes' men to turn their bodies at the wrong moments, to split their attention, to lose sight of where Ethan would strike next. Ethan, bruised and half-breathless, used the openings she created. One direct blow, one shove into unstable ground, one hard charge that drove a man sideways into the basin wall. They fought as if they had been learning each other all along, which in truth they had. Within moments, Hayes lost his shape of control. One man stumbled away injured, another bleeding from the forehead backed toward the ridge. The third looked to Hayes instead of fighting, and in that hesitation, Ethan drove him down. Hayes saw it then, not just that he might lose, but that he had already lost the certainty of winning. He retreated one step, then another. "This isn't finished," he said, breathing harder now. "No," Ayanna replied. "It isn't." For a moment, Ethan thought Hayes might try one last desperate rush. But Hayes was not brave enough to confuse rage with courage. He looked at the basin, the water hidden under it, the two people still standing between him and what he wanted. Then he turned away. "Move," he snapped at his men. They withdrew up the ridge, stumbling more than riding. At first, pride wounded worse than flesh. At the top, Hayes looked back once. "You think this changes anything?" he called down. "It doesn't." Then he was gone. The basin fell quiet, except for the sound of rough breathing and wind moving over stone. Ethan remained still for a long second, waiting for the world to rush again. It didn't. Ayanna lowered her knife. The fight was over. Not the whole war, not yet, but something decisive had shifted. Ethan looked at her. Dust streaked her cheek. Her shoulder was trembling from strain, and still she stood steady, eyes clear. "We're done running," he said. Ayanna held his gaze. "Yes." Together, they turned back to the earth. They dug where the dampness was strongest, widening the cut-clearing rock and packed clay. Ethan used all the strength he had left. Ayanna guided the line with quick, precise corrections, reading the slope, redirecting the path. At first, only mud gathered. Then a darker pulse welled beneath it. A thin line of water appeared, trembling in the channel they had opened. Then another. Then a small but steady flow, cold and bright against the dust. Neither of them spoke. They simply watched as the impossible became real. Over the days that followed, the trickle became a stream strong enough to guide. Ethan carved shallow runoffs. Ayanna shaped the channels with stones and packed earth so the water spread instead of vanishing. The dry land drank greedily. The soil softened. The smell of dust slowly gave way to the smell of damp ground and living roots. The change was not sudden, but it was undeniable. The valley had been waiting for this longer than either of them knew. They returned to the ranch, what remained of it. Burned wood, half-fallen beams, blackened earth where the stable had been. Ethan stood there a long time the first morning back. Then he picked up a hammer. This time when he worked, it was not out of numb habit. He rebuilt with purpose. He cut new posts, repaired fence lines, cleared the charred remains of what could not be saved, guided water toward the most damaged parts of the land. Ayanna worked beside him, not behind him, not as a guest or a debt to be repaid, but as an equal hand in every decision. She saw things Ethan missed. How to angle runoff to preserve the slope. Which sections of ground should rest before being planted. Where to leave wild growth untouched because it protected the soil. He knew the structure of the ranch. She understood the deeper behavior of the land itself. Together, they made something neither could have built alone. As the days passed, Ethan changed with the place. He no longer moved like a man sleepwalking through duty. There was intention in him now. Direction. He spoke more, laughed once or twice without realizing it, looked ahead instead of only back. And when he thought of his father, the memory no longer came wrapped in blind reverence or raw pain. It came with complexity. His father had loved this land, that Ethan still believed. But he had also failed it, and failed others through it. The inheritance left behind was not only acreage and broken fences, it was responsibility, a chance to choose differently. Ethan accepted that at last. Ayanna saw the change before he ever named it. She too had changed in the space they made together. She was no longer simply the wounded woman he had found in the woods, no longer someone passing through his life under threat. She shaped the future of the ranch with him. She argued when needed, corrected him when he was stubborn, chose where new channels should run, where to plant first, where to let the land recover in silence. Peace, when it finally came, looked smaller than people imagined. It looked like shared work under an open sky, like two cups placed side by side on a porch step at dusk. Like silence that no longer needed to defend itself. One evening, after a long day of mending the last section of fence near the spring line, they sat together outside the house. The valley before them had begun to green in places that had been dead for years. A breeze moved through the grass softly enough to sound like breathing. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "I used to think if I kept working hard enough," he said, "I could hold on to what was left." Ayanna turned toward him. "But now I think—" He let out a quiet breath. "I think I was really waiting for a reason to build anything at all." She said nothing, and he was grateful for that. He looked down at his hands. "I don't want you to leave." The words stayed in the air between them, simple and unadorned. Ayanna's gaze rested on him with a softness he had not seen there before. "That is not a small thing to say." "No," Ethan admitted. "It isn't." He expected her to turn away, to remind him of everything that made such a future uncertain. Instead, she said, "I have not wanted to leave for some time." He looked up then, and whatever had been growing between them ceased to be hidden. It was not gratitude, not rescue, not the kind of affection born from loneliness alone. It was made of trust hard-earned, of danger survived side by side, of grief seen clearly and not turned away from, of choices repeated until they became devotion. Ethan reached for her hand slowly enough to give her time to refuse. She didn't. In the quiet that followed, words became unnecessary. But peace did not erase the final question. Ayanna still had a people, a history, a place beyond the ranch that called to her in ways Ethan could never claim for himself. Days later, when the water channels were finally running clean and the first planted rows began to hold, she stood at the edge of the property and looked toward the distant line of hills. "I could go back," she said. Ethan stood beside her. "I know. I could tell them what happened here, what we found." He nodded. She glanced at him then, as if measuring what kind of man he had become. "And if I choose to stay, then stay because you want this life," he said. "Not because of what we survived, not because you owe me anything." Ayanna studied him for a long moment. That answer mattered more than he could explain. He did not ask again, did not plead, did not build a cage out of love and call it devotion. Instead, he waited. The silence between them grew deep and full, but not uneasy. It was the silence of a threshold. At last, Ayanna reached beneath her collar and drew out a small necklace beads and a carved pendant worn smooth by years of use. She held it in her palm for a moment, then placed it in Ethan's hand. "This belonged to my mother," she said. Ethan looked at it, then back at her. "If I leave," she said softly, "it remains with you." The word struck him harder than any declaration. "And if you stay?" he asked. Ayanna stepped closer. "That means I trusted you enough to leave it nowhere else." Then after one final beat of stillness, she chose. She stayed, not as someone rescued, not as someone hiding, but as a woman who had looked at the life before her and stepped toward it freely. The seasons began to turn. With water came growth. With growth came animals. Birds returned first, then deer at the edges of the fields, then the subtle restoration of balance that made the whole valley seem less haunted by drought. The ranch that neighbors had once circled like vultures became something else entirely living. Valuable, impossible to dismiss. People noticed. They rode past slower now, looked longer. Some asked questions. Some kept their distance, uncertain what to make of the land's transformation. But Hayes did not return, and those who had once waited for Ethan to fail found themselves with nothing to say. The land no longer belonged to men like him in the way they imagined ownership. It had been fought for, healed, and earned. One evening, many weeks later, Ethan stood on the rise above the ranch and looked down over the valley. Water moved in silver threads where there had once only been dust. New fence lines held firm. The rebuilt stable caught the light of the sinking sun. Below, Ayanna crossed the yard carrying tools, purposeful and unhurried, as if she had always belonged there. For the first time since his father's death, Ethan felt no emptiness. He thought of the grave in Red Hollow, of the old watch still ticking in his pocket, of the man his father had been good in, some ways flawed, in others responsible for more than Ethan could ignore. And yet the memory no longer crushed him. He understood it now in a different way. Inheritance was never just what a man received. It was what he chose to do after receiving it. Ethan had been left a dying ranch, a broken history, and the weight of another man's mistakes. But he had also been left a chance, a narrow one, hard-earned, and nearly lost to choose what kind of man he would be. He looked out over the land once more, then turned and walked back down toward the life waiting for him. Behind him, the valley held water. Ahead of him, it held everything else. 5 years passed faster than Ethan ever thought time could move. At first, he measured it in small changes, the widening of water channels the first season where crops held through the heat, the moment when the soil stopped cracking beneath his boots. But somewhere along the way, those small changes became something larger, something steady, something that no longer felt like survival, but like life. The ranch did not just recover, it transformed. What had once been dry, brittle land now held color, real color. Fields stretched out in uneven but thriving patches of green. Rows of crops followed the lines of water that Ethan and Ayanna had carved into the earth with their own hands. The channels had grown more refined over time, shaped and reshaped with experience, until the flow of water felt almost natural, as if the land itself had finally remembered what it was meant to be. The livestock had returned next. First, a few animals carefully chosen, manageable. Then more, healthy, strong, the kind that did not just survive, but grew. The sound of hooves, once absent, became part of the rhythm of the place again. Chickens scratched through the yard. Cattle moved slowly across open ground that no longer looked like a risk. Even the air felt different, less empty, less heavy. Word spread. It always did. At first, people came quietly riding past, at a distance, pretending they had no reason to stop. They looked at the land the same way they used to, measuring it, judging it, waiting to see if the change would hold. But it did, season after season. Eventually, they stopped pretending. Some came with questions, some with offers, a few with apologies hidden behind polite conversation. Men who had once waited for Ethan to fail now stood at his fence asking how he had done it, asking if he would consider working with them, asking if he could show them how to bring water to their own dying land. Ethan never turned them away, but he didn't give everything either. What he shared carefully. Enough to help. Enough to prove that the land could be healed if it was treated with respect. But never in a way that allowed someone like Hayes to take control again. Because that was the difference now. This land was not something to be taken. It was something to be built with. And people were beginning to understand that. But the greatest change was not the land. It was what had grown on it. Children. Their laughter carried farther than any sound the ranch had known before. Two of them ran through the tall grass that afternoon, chasing each other between rows of crops that had not existed 5 years earlier. Their footsteps were light, unburdened, their voices loud in a way that filled every corner of the place. A third child followed more slowly, smaller, determined not to be left behind. Ethan stood at the edge of the field watching them with a quiet expression that said more than any words could. There had been a time when silence defined this place. Now it was something else entirely. The children did not know what the land had been before. They did not know the weight of the drought or the fire or the fear that had once lived in every shadow of the valley. To them this was simply home, a place where water flowed, where food grew, where people stayed. And Ayanna stood among them, not behind, not apart, but at the center of it all. She had never lost who she was. Time had not erased her past, nor had this land replaced it. Instead, she carried both worlds with her in a way that shaped everything around her. She still wore the symbols of her people, subtle but present. The patterns in her clothing, the small marks she carved into wood when they built something new. The necklace she had once nearly left behind now rested against her skin, as it always had. She taught the children differently than Ethan did, where he showed them how to mend fences, how to work the soil, how to manage livestock. She showed them how to listen, how to read the wind before it changed, how to see water before it surfaced, how to walk through the forest without disturbing what lived there. She told them stories not just of the land they stood on, but of the land beyond it, of her people, of traditions that did not belong to the ranch but were welcome within it. And sometimes when the seasons allowed, riders came, not strangers, family, members of her tribe who had heard what she had done, who had seen the change in the valley, who understood that this place was no longer just a ranch, it was something more. A bridge, a place where two ways of living did not erase each other, but learned to stand side by side. Ayanna was no longer running. She was leading. And Ethan? Ethan was no longer the man who had stood in silence beside a grave, unsure of what to do with the life left behind. He had become something else entirely. People came to him now, not with doubt, but with respect. They asked for his opinion, his judgment, his help, not because of who his father had been, but because of who he had chosen to become. He walked the land differently now. Not like someone trying to hold on to something fragile, but like someone who understood its strength and his responsibility to it. When he spoke, people listened. When he made a decision, it carried weight. And when he looked at the future, there was no hesitation in his eyes, only direction. Still, he never erased the past. At the far edge of the ranch, there stood an old wooden post, weathered, cracked, marked with the same symbol he had once recognized on the map, his father's mark. Ethan could have removed it, burned it, buried it under new work and new growth. But he didn't. He left it exactly where it had been, a reminder. Not of guilt alone, but of truth. The past did not disappear just because the future improved. It stayed. And it mattered. Ethan visited that post, sometimes standing there in quiet moments, not as a man haunted, but as a man who understood. He no longer saw his father as a hero or a villain, just a man who had made choices, some good, some terrible. And he understood now that the meaning of those choices did not end with the man who made them. It continued. In what came next. Evenings were his favorite time. Not because of the work, though, there was always work, but because of the stillness that followed it. That night, the sky stretched wide and clear above the valley, painted in shades of gold and fading blue. The air was warm, carrying the scent of grass and water and something alive. Ethan sat on the porch, leaning back slightly, his arms resting on his knees. Ayanna sat beside him. They did not speak at first. They didn't need to. In the distance, the children's laughter softened as they tired their voices, drifting closer to the house. The cattle moved slowly across the far field, their shapes dark against the light. It was the kind of moment that once would have felt impossible. Now it was simply part of their life. "You remember the day you found me?" Ayanna asked quietly. Ethan let out a small breath, almost a laugh. "Hard to forget. You could have walked away. I almost did." She turned her head slightly, studying him. What changed your mind? Ethan thought about that. Not the version of the answer he might give someone else. Not something simple or easy. The truth. "I didn't want to be the kind of man who could walk away," he said. Ayanna watched him for a moment longer, then nodded once. That choice changed everything she said. Ethan looked out over the land. "Yeah," he said. It did. There was a pause. Then one of the children ran up the steps, breathless and smiling. "Pa," the boy said, "why did you help her?" Ethan glanced at Ayanna, then back at the child. He could have said many things, about responsibility, about right and wrong, about the past. But none of those felt right. So he answered simply. "Because it mattered," he said. The child seemed satisfied with that. And in a way, so was Ethan. Because that was the truth stripped of everything else. It had mattered. And because of that, everything that came after had mattered too. The land, the water, the life they had built. Ayanna rested her hand lightly against his, a quiet gesture that carried years of meaning. Neither of them needed to say more. They already understood. Ethan had once believed that the past defined him. That what his father had done, what he had inherited, what he had lost, those things were fixed. Unchangeable. But standing there now, watching the land breathe with life, he understood something different. The past was not something he could rewrite. But it was not something that decided the end of his story either. That part had always been his, and Ayanna's, and every choice they made after. The valley stretched wide before him, no longer empty, no longer silent. Full, alive, real. Ethan stepped off the porch and walked a few paces into the field, the grass brushing lightly against his boots. He stopped at the same place he had stood years before, when everything had been dry, when the future had felt like nothing more than a weight. Then pressing down on him. Now it felt like something else. He turned slightly. Ayanna stood behind him, the fading light catching the outline of her figure. The children moved around her, their laughter softer now, tired but content. He was not alone. Not in the way that had once defined him. Not in any way that mattered. Ethan looked out across the land one last time, taking in everything it had become. And for the first time, he did not see what had been lost. He saw what had been built, what had been chosen, what had grown from something broken into something whole. He drew in a slow breath, then let it go. He didn't inherit a future. He built one. And what was once broken had become the reason everything else could grow. Thank you so much for watching and being part of this journey. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything and helps us bring you more meaningful stories like this. See you in the next video.